Good morning, guys. Today we're just going to really quickly walk through the roots of the Cold War. You're going to open up the slides, the Google slides. These are just going to be notes. Okay, so what you want to do to start off with is go online, look up Cold War, okay, and give me the definition historically of what the Cold War was. So I'll give you guys a minute to do that on your own. Brief definition's fine. And what we're going to do today is we're just going to culminate today's lesson with a very basic question. And that basic question is, in what different ways did the United States and the Soviet Union compete for influence during the course of the Cold War? Okay, so take a minute to define the Cold War, and you guys can pause me and then come back, and I'll go on to the next slide. Okay, from World War to Cold War, you guys already know that the Soviet Union had serious differences with the United States and Great Britain. And what you guys need to know, and you guys want to write this down, is that before World War II, the British and the United States saw the Soviet Union as a big threat. In fact, politically, there were a lot of people in the 1930s. Again, you guys want to write this down for your notes. There were a lot of individuals and also nations in the 1930s that saw the Soviet Union as a bigger threat to democracy than Mussolini and Hitler. And that's why there were some people that advocated allowing Germany to regain its military strength to become kind of like a buffer or a barrier between the communist Soviet Union in the East and democratic nations in the West. Okay. The United States, believe it or not, we never even recognized the Soviet Union as a legitimate government. We basically, it was our opinion that the Bolsheviks basically illegally took power in the Soviet Union against the will of the people, which was true. Okay, the Bolsheviks were a minority in Russia. So there's a couple of things that already, led to big differences before World War II even began. Okay, so you guys want to write those three things down. You had the difference between communism in the Soviet Union and democracy in Western Europe, the United States. So make sure you guys have that. The other big difference is that many saw the Soviet Union as a threat to democracy. And then the final one was that a lot of Western nations like the U.S. and Britain didn't even recognize the Soviet Union, okay, as a legitimate government. And they were excluded from the League of Nations. They weren't even invited to join, okay? So when you take a look at that, you can understand why the Soviet Union under Stalin wasn't really all that warm and fuzzy to the United States and Britain during and after the war. We were really just friends of convenience, okay? We both, us and the Soviets, realized that Hitler, constituted a menace to world peace for both sides. But now that the war is over, we're going to see that those old hostilities bubble right back up to the surface. Okay? So make sure you guys have the 3 bullet points that I outlined for you there. Okay, let's take a look at World War II deaths. Okay, and this is going to get us into a conversation about the differing objectives after the war was over. And you guys can see the Soviet Union, because of the Holocaust, and also because of combat. A lot of the war was fought in the Soviet Union. You guys know that in Eastern Europe after Operation Barbarossa. When you take a look at this, okay, the Soviet Union, they absorbed by far the most deaths during World War II. You guys can see China is a close second. All right, so when you look at the percent of the population, okay, over 10% of the Soviet Union's population was killed during World War II. All right, which is an enormous percentage. So you can understand why the Soviet Union was reeling after the war was over. Okay, and you can understand why they were looking for compensation when the war was over. Now, when you compare that to the Western Allies. The United States, we don't have any civilian casualties, which makes sense because the war wasn't fought in the United States. Great Britain had very few civilian casualties. Okay, you guys can see that we had all totaled, less than 300,000 deaths during World War II. Same thing with Great Britain. So when you take a look at that, we were like a blip on the radar screen as far as the human toll and the human cost of World War II. Okay, and you guys can see very, very insignificant percentages of our population were killed during the war. All right, so you can understand why the Soviet Union had a little bit of a different outlook when the war was over. Okay, they were devastated by World War II. Okay, just an enormous loss of life, obviously. And remember, the war was fought in the Soviet Union. It was utterly devastated. Railroads were ripped up. Infrastructure and industries were destroyed by the German occupational forces. Land was cleared of its civilian inhabitants, as you guys know, as part of the policy of Lebensraum and giving German people living space. So you really are looking at almost like a post-apocalyptic situation in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Okay, and you guys can see how most of Eastern Europe's countries are listed here. Poland, you guys can see an enormous civilian toll. And by the way, Poland had the biggest percentage of its population wiped out during World War II. Almost a full quarter of their population was killed during the war. Okay. You go down to, let's see here, it doesn't have Latvia and Lithuania, but it should because they were part of the Soviet Union. But you guys get the idea. Okay. Eastern Europe was utterly devastated. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Military expenditure. Okay, this is how much money each country spent during the course of World War I and the years after the war. Okay, and you guys can see that during the war, there's a huge spike in spending from the United States. Okay, over $700 billion. Okay, was spent during World War II to fight and win the war. Okay, and believe it or not, as a percentage of our gross domestic product, the United States was actually in more debt back then than it is today. Okay, so all these people that talk about the doom and gloom of the debt, which is obviously out of hand. Okay, what they fail to mention is that we actually were in much greater debt percentage wise back during World War II. Okay, we spent a ton of money, obviously. Okay, you guys can see the Soviets, even though their expenditures go up gradually, you start to see the Soviet Union, outspend the United States in military expenditure after the war, and that's because of the Cold War. Okay, because of the Cold War, we're going to see the Soviets are going to try to outspend and outproduce the United States in military equipment to try to stay at par with them. Okay, all right. So you guys can see the U.S. we spent a ton of money. Okay, other countries obviously during the war spent a lot of money too. Germany's a distant second at $400 billion. Okay. And you have obviously Great Britain is pretty far behind as well. Okay. All right. Let's take a look at the post-war issues really quickly. Just because of how the war was fought, Europe was destined once again to be divided between East and West. Okay. You had the Soviets reconquering land from the Germans. Okay, you guys can see they overran Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Okay, they overran Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. These are all parts of the Eastern Theater. Okay, so the Soviet armies, they basically ran roughshod over all of Eastern Europe. And if you remember from our discussions back before D-Day, the United States and the Western Allies, the British, we were worried that if we don't get into Western Europe as soon as possible, the Soviets are going to occupy all of Europe. Okay. And if they do that, we're afraid that they're going to install communist governments. Okay. So one of the things that you guys want to write down here under post-war issues is we were afraid of the Soviet Union spreading communism and spreading their influence. We didn't want to see that idea or that ideology spreading outside of the natural borders of the Soviet Union. They had already, during the war, installed a pro-communist government in Poland. Okay, they're going to do the same thing in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in Yugoslavia, okay, in Romania, in Bulgaria. All these countries are going to be basically forced into inserting communist dictatorships that are friendly to Stalin. And we're going to see the same thing is going to happen in Eastern Germany. Okay, so the eastern part of Germany was actually, a Soviet occupational zone. Okay, and Germany itself was divided up. If you guys remember from reading about Yalta and Potsdam, Okay, the idea was we were going to demilitarize Germany, and each of the Allied powers was going to get a quarter of Germany to basically oversee its demilitarization and denazification. Okay, so one of the big issues that we had after the war was the Soviets didn't go home. They kept their tanks all along this western border here of the areas that they had occupied during World War II. We kept some military equipment there, but not much. Most of the stuff we sent back home or just got rid of. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, but you guys can see, there's a dividing line. Okay, we now have East with pro-Soviet, pro-communist governments that have been installed by Stalin, and the reason why Stalin did that is because Russia had been invaded twice in 30 years. Okay, he wanted as much distance between himself and the Western Allies as possible. Because remember, he didn't trust the Western Allies, and quite frankly, he shouldn't have. Okay, we were not big fans of him. So it wasn't just about spreading influence for Stalin. It was about creating an insulation or a buffer zone between Russia and Western Europe to basically keep him safe. Okay. All right. The other thing, you guys want to write this down as well. Stalin is looking for compensation, and rightfully so. Remember, the Soviet Union lost an enormous amount of manpower and industrial might. So, one of the things that Stalin's doing in Eastern Europe is he's literally deconstructing factories and industrial equipment, and he's shipping it back to the Soviet Union as compensation for what happened during World War II. Okay. So, he's literally ransacking Eastern Europe to basically get back on his feet economically. We're going to see the Allies are going to have a much different approach to Western Europe. Okay, even Germany. Okay, so even though Germany was our enemy, we are going to take a much different approach. Okay, if you guys remember, after World War II or World War I, we punished Germany, and we're going to see the Allies, the British, the French, and the United States. We come together to try to help Germany and get them back on their feet as quickly as possible. Okay. And you guys want to write this down. The reason why we're so willing to help Italy, Germany, France, okay, even Japan on the other far side of the world, the reason why we're willing to help is because we don't want them turning communism. Okay, you guys want to write this down. Our theory was that if these countries were prosperous and happy after World War II, they wouldn't need to turn to communism. Okay, so we have two very different worlds envisioned by the Soviet Union. One where they're trying to create a buffer zone that's going to keep them safe from Western hostility, where they're enforcing communism against people's will. And in the West, we have the United States and the British encouraging democracy, and we want to stimulate these countries' economies to get them back on their feet, get them strong, get them solid, get them voting again, so that way the world can recover economically and politically. Okay, so we have very, very different approaches when the war is over. Make sure you guys have that written down. Okay. All right, spreading influence. Okay, there's a question I want you guys to think about real quick. Given the extreme sacrifice made by the Soviet Union during the course of the war, what might have been some demands? Okay, actually, we already answered this. So if you guys want to just kind of write down, what Stalin wanted, he wanted a recompensation for damages. He wanted more land as a buffer. Okay, so make sure you guys have both those things down. All right, and you guys can pause and jot those two things down. All right, this stuff's already been covered, so we're going to kind of skip that slide. Okay, I already talked about, Stalin putting, communist or Soviet-friendly governments in Poland and Czechoslovakia. Okay, if you guys want to listen to Churchill's speech, that's fine, but it's really long. Back when we had time, we would have done this, but today we don't. Okay? All right, now we have Germany. Okay, so the fate of Germany was a big deal. Okay, and the epicenter of the Cold War was basically this little blip on the radar screen. That's Berlin. Germany was divided between the British, the French, the Americans, and we had an international zone down here, and the Soviets in the east. Okay, Germany was geographically changed. Okay, you guys can see Poland was literally moved geographically to the west as compensation for what Poland had lost during the war. Okay, so you had Polish people moving into what had traditionally, ethnically, been German areas, places like Posen. Okay, were now going to be Polish and not German. So you actually had Germans being forced to uproot and move, further west. East Prussia, which for a long time was German territory, going way back to, the medieval period. Okay, Königsberg. Okay, all this was basically taken by the Soviet Union and the international community and given either to Poland or to Latvia. Really, what they were doing was they were pretty much handing it to Soviet influence. Okay, um, now when you take a look at Berlin, okay, Berlin was a huge flashpoint during World War II, or sorry, during the Cold War, because it basically was where the Allies and the Soviets directly faced off. Okay, we had a complete difference in approach to how the post-war world was going to look. You have the British and the Americans working hard to rebuild West Berlin to get people back on their feet, back to work. We wanted to get nightclubs back open. We wanted to get the stores back open. We wanted to restore electricity and running water. The Soviet Union, literally right across the street here in East Berlin, they're deconstructing railroads, whatever industries left. They're shipping it back. They're not rebuilding. So you can imagine a lot of people that lived in the Soviet zone. If you're them, you don't want to stay there because the Soviets are, the other thing that we didn't mention is because of how terribly the Germans treated the Soviets during World War II because of the Holocaust. Obviously, the Soviets did not take too kindly to the Germans when they occupied Germany. Okay, millions of rapes occurred. Okay, a lot of murders occurred. A lot of retribution murders took place in Eastern Germany by the Red Army. So a lot of people, even in Poland and Czechoslovakia, they started trickling into West Berlin. Okay, a lot of people started fleeing the Soviet occupied zones. They wanted to get the heck out of there because they did not want to be part of a communist dictatorship. Okay, and right after the war, West Berlin was wide open. It was like a little island of democracy and prosperity in the middle of a sea of devastation. Okay, so if you're the Soviet Union, you can imagine why you don't really like West Berlin. You don't like the fact that the Allies are making you look bad, and that people that live in the zones that you're occupying are trying to get the hell out of there. So the Soviets turned to a pretty blatant policy. They actually closed off West Berlin. They put tanks all around the roads, and the reason why they did that is they wanted the Western Allies to get out of West Berlin. They wanted to basically, they didn't want this little zone of Western occupation to be kind of like a sore, I guess, or a thorn in their side. So they actually blockaded it. Okay. And this is the first big showdown of the Cold War. So what we do in response, we don't want to go to war over West Berlin. In fact, the war's over. We're demilitarizing. Millions of guys are being shipped home. Half of our tanks, were just kind of, this is going to sound ridiculous. A lot of our military equipment was pushed off the side of ships into the ocean because we just didn't need it anymore. And a lot of it was obsolete by the time the war was over, okay? So we figured, we're not going to fight the Soviets, but we're not going to let them have West Berlin, okay? They can't just blockade us out of something that was given, to the international community. So we actually started airlifting by airplane supplies into West Berlin. We flew in food, we flew in, medical supplies, building supplies, everything we needed to rebuild West Berlin and to get it back on its feet. And we were daring, and you guys want to write this down, we were basically challenging the Soviets to shoot down one of those planes. And we wanted to see what their reaction would be, okay? Well, the Soviets didn't, okay? They basically sat there for a year and watched this enormous fleet of airplanes fly in supplies every single day. And it kept Berlin on its feet, all right? And eventually, after a year of this, the Soviets backed down. They said, okay, you know what? We'll open up a couple of roads to Berlin. We'll open up a railroad access to West Berlin so you guys can, travel, back and forth and ferry supplies in. Okay, so what do you guys want to write down? This is basically the playbook for the Cold War. And this is how both sides approach one another. We would challenge the other side. The Americans and the British would challenge the Soviets to see what the Soviet response was. The Soviets or the United States or the Western Allies would respond peacefully or aggressively, but without risking war. And then both sides would eventually back down. That's essentially how the Cold War played out, okay? Um, did we come close to military confrontation during the course of the Cold War? Yeah, we did. But we never, ever were foolish enough to actually go to war. And we're going to talk about why that was in a couple of seconds here, okay? Okay, here we have supplies being ferried into West Berlin. Okay. All right. Seeking a new policy towards the Soviets following the Second World War. Why might both the Allies and the Soviets want to avoid war with one another? That's a pretty obvious answer, so I want you guys to jot that down. You think about the amount of money the United States spent during the war, and now the war's over, we're in debt. Think about the human toll that the Soviets had to go through. Think about the new weapons that the United States and soon the Soviets are now going to have at their disposal. Okay, what type of weapons would make it so we don't really want to fight a war against one another because it would be ridiculous. Okay, so just jot down some ideas there. All right. All right. The Soviet Union, they're looking to expand their influence in Eastern Europe. Okay. So what might be our policy regarding that? Okay. Now the Soviets, yeah, they still had tanks there, but we knew that they didn't want a war. Okay. We knew that they were kind of just posturing. They couldn't afford another war. They didn't want another war. So how would we stop the Soviets from spreading influence? Remember, their idea is to spread communism, to keep a buffer zone between themselves and the rest of Western Europe. The policy is fairly simple. Communism is basically a classless society where the government essentially owns all rights to property, things like that. It oversees the economy. So we've talked about all this stuff before. All right. So what might we do in Western Europe to make communism look bad and to stop people in Western Europe from wanting to turn to communism? Okay. So just write down some ideas there. And while you're doing that, I'm going to move forward. All right, guys, changing American role in global politics. Before World War II, we really were isolationists. World War One, we only came into it at the very end, and we only did because we were forced into it. World War II, we came in after 3 years of war, and again, we were forced into it. Okay, so what I want you guys to write down, our role is going to be completely different. Okay, we now are going to basically intervene in problems before they become bigger problems. Okay, and this is where a lot of people, have become critical of the United States in the past 70 years. We've kind of gotten the moniker as the world police, okay? But the reason why we do that is because in the past, when we sat back on our hands and didn't do anything, international problems, they got much bigger than they had to be, okay? So make sure you guys jot that down. Okay, we're going to play a much more active role in international politics after World War II. We still obviously, continue to play an active role. In fact, you could still argue that we're the world leader in interaction in the global community. Okay. And the next question: how might this change of policy affect the future of American foreign policy? Okay, so you guys want to write down some pretty obvious things that you've noticed about how we interact in the international community. All right, that brings us to the Truman Doctrine. I want you guys to read this really quickly. Okay, and I want you guys just to jot down how Harry S. Truman, the President of the United States, is looking to limit Soviet expansion without actually confronting them. Okay, so just answer that question after you guys read the document. Won't take you too long, and I'll move forward. All right, the Marshall Plan. This is connected to the Truman Plan. You guys already know from reading the Truman Doctrine that our policy is to contain the Soviet Union. We want to keep it where it is. Okay, we don't want them expanding, but we're not going to risk war. We're not going to fight to push them back to their borders. The theory is communism is so bad that if you just let it sit there and fester in one place, it's eventually going to fail. Okay, so you guys can go through these different points. Very simple stuff. Following the war, Europe was devastated physically and economically. So how could the Allies prevent the Soviets from spreading their ideas to nations of war-ravaged Western Europe? I think it's pretty simple. Okay, you guys want to write this down? Or actually, we already have it, so it's there for you. The U.S., we gave enormous amounts of money to Western Europe to help rebuild. Okay, we wanted to get these economies back on their feet. We wanted people happy. We wanted them prosperous. Because if you have all that stuff, you don't need the government to give you, the basic necessities of life like the communists did. Okay, so you have all the basic ideas of the Marshall Plan. All right, so the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan are interconnected. We're going to contain communism to where it is, let it, basically dry up and fester on its own, even though it took, decades for that to happen. It did work, though. And how are we going to do that? We're going to give money and aid to people that actually need it. Okay. All right, now this leads to the breakdown of two distinct alliance pacts, one of which still exists. You guys want to write this down? NATO is an acronym for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Okay, and its job was simple. The United States was the leading member of NATO. Okay, but in the post-war world, all right, you had basically all these Western European countries joining a military alliance, and the rules were simple. If any member of NATO was attacked by any Soviet occupied territory, they would all these countries, including the United States, would overwhelmingly attack the Soviet Union, because the assumption was that all these little countries that the Soviets had occupied, they are basically puppets. Okay, these are Stalin's little areas. So even though there might be, a different communist government in East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, we knew that the reality was they were being heavily influenced by Stalin and the Soviet Union. So if any of these countries launched an invasion of, say, Western Germany or Italy or Greece or Norway, okay, that we were all going to band together and attack the Soviet Union. Okay, now the Soviets created their own treaty. They created the Warsaw Pact, when Warsaw's in Poland here, and the Warsaw Pact was basically their version of NATO. If any Warsaw Pact nation was attacked by any member of NATO, which would have never been the case because it was a defensive policy, but the Soviets wanted to save face. They said if any of these countries were attacked by Western Europe or NATO, that they would all respond overwhelmingly against the leaders of NATO, so basically Great Britain and the United States. Okay, the difference is this: the Warsaw Pact. These countries were forced into it. You guys want to write that down? They had no choice. NATO was a free, willing alliance. This is basically an alliance of willing, partners against Soviet expansion and aggression. Okay. All right, there are proxy wars. We're not going to get into this too much because we just don't have time. The Korean War in the 1950s was an example of us trying to limit the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, they gave tons of money and equipment to China and also to communist North Korea. If you guys remember, the Soviets had actually moved all the way down half of the North Korean peninsula, or the Korean peninsula, in anticipation of helping with the invasion of Japan that never happened. Okay. But during the Korean War, the Chinese, okay, they backed the North Korean government, which was communist, obviously, because Stalin imposed communism there. In fact, if you still want to see what a Stalinist regime looks like, all you have to do is look at North Korea, okay, because Kim Jong-il, who was the original leader, the dear leader of North Korea, he was a Stalinist, okay, and he still uses the same tactics of the totalitarian state, or sorry, his grandson does, that Stalin would have used, okay. We supported South Korea. Okay, the war was basically fought to contain communism into the north. All right, and the war went back and forth for 3 years, but we basically came up with this line of demarcation, which would be demilitarized, still there today. Okay, so this is basically an active war zone, believe it or not, where we have men manning the line here. The North Koreans have men manning the line here. Again, this is a successful war of containment. We kept communism into the northern half of the Korean Peninsula. Okay, an unsuccessful war of containment, which you guys might be familiar with, was the Vietnam War. Now, we're not going to get into the politics of it because it's very, very, well, that's not very complicated, but it's a little bit too much for me to get into right now. All you need to know is that under a leader named Ho Chi Minh, who actually was our ally during World War II, Vietnam, we were afraid was going to turn communist because he was a communist, okay? So we actually intervened, and the international community split Vietnam in half. We created North and South Vietnam. We imposed really a fairly corrupt government down here in the South, and claimed it was democratic when in reality it was fairly dictatorial. But up here in North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh established a communist regime. He was again heavily influenced and heavily supplied by China and the Soviet Union with tanks and equipment if he needed it. In 1965, the Vietnam War starts. It was basically North Vietnam trying to absorb South Vietnam to create one unified Vietnamese country, which is still unified today. And it was going to unite under the flag of communism and Ho Chi Minh. Okay, the United States, we sent hundreds of thousands of men to help the South Vietnamese government fight off and stop the North Vietnamese communists from, taking over South Vietnam. And after a very long war, a 10-year war, we eventually just quit. let's be honest. We're not going to get into the particulars of it, but eventually we just went home. We lost, almost 60,000 men over 10 years. It was a mess. A lot of Americans didn't want to be involved in it. We thought the war was not in our best interest. Um, and Vietnam, we could probably argue, is a lot better off, under communist leadership than it would have been under the Vietnamese leadership. Okay, so you have, you could argue that it might have done better under, democracy and capitalism. Okay, but Vietnam has made out pretty well as a country compared to where it came from, where it is now. Either way, this is an unsuccessful war of containment. The North Vietnamese achieved their objective. They unified South Vietnam in 1975 with North Vietnam under the flag of communism. Okay, all right, and that's where we're going to stop today. Okay, so the question that you guys are going to respond to is going to be very simple. It's going to be on the stream, and that question basically is going to ask you. Please tell me this was recording. It is. Is it? Okay. All right. Anyway. Okay, and the question is going to ask you how us and the Soviets competed for influence in different ways. Okay? All right, and I will see you guys tomorrow.